10 months after their bitter split, Callista held her 1-year-old daughter in the emergency room. The test results fell like a hammer. Audrey needed a bone marrow donor tonight, or she wouldn't make it through. The chances were nearly zero unless her biological father was a match. When leather shoes stopped beneath the fluorescent lights, she looked up. Leon Harrington, the CEO she'd left behind, had returned. Had he come to save their child? Or to reclaim her heart? The December rain struck the windows of Mount Sinai Hospital with relentless precision, each drop a reminder that time was running out. New York City sprawled beneath the storm clouds, its millions of lights blurring through the water-streaked glass. In the pediatric emergency wing, the steady beep of heart monitors created a mechanical symphony that cut through the silence. Callista Monroe sat rigid in the uncomfortable plastic chair, her blonde hair falling in exhausted waves around her face. She hadn't slept in 36 hours, not since Audrey's fever had spiked to 104 degrees. Her fingers clutched the soft pink blanket that had been with them since the ambulance ride, its fabric now damp with her daughter's sweat. At 32, Callista had learned to be strong. Life as a single mother had carved away any softness she'd once possessed, replacing naivety with fierce practicality. She worked as an accounting assistant at a small firm in Brooklyn, juggling night shifts and daycare schedules with the precision of a military operation. Their one-bedroom apartment in Queens wasn't much, but she'd made it a home, filling it with secondhand toys and handmade decorations. Every dollar was stretched, every moment planned. She'd built this life brick by brick, alone, and she'd been proud of that independence. Until tonight, Audrey Monroe lay still on the hospital bed, her tiny chest rising and falling with labored breaths. At 1 year old, she should have been taking her first real steps, saying her first clear words. Instead, an oxygen mask covered half her face, an IV line snaked from her impossibly small wrist. The fever had stolen the usual brightness from her hazel eyes, but when she was awake for those brief moments, they still held that spark of curiosity that reminded Callista so painfully of her father. The tiny charm bracelet on Audrey's wrist caught the harsh hospital lighting a delicate silver piece with a small moon pendant that had arrived mysteriously on the day she was born. Leon Harrington existed in a different universe entirely. At 36, he commanded boardrooms with the same ease most people ordered coffee. His technology empire stretched across 3 continents, built on innovation and an almost obsessive need for control. The tailored suits, the corner office overlooking Manhattan, the army of assistants, all carefully constructed walls around a man who'd learned early that vulnerability was weakness. He lived by schedules and spreadsheets, measuring success in quarterly reports and market dominance. His brown eyes, which the business magazines called penetrating, held a coldness that kept even his closest associates at arm's length. He didn't know he had a daughter. The thought had never even crossed his mind. Henry Monroe paced the hallway outside, his 58 years showing in the deep lines around his eyes. Callista's father was a man of rigid principles, a retired construction foreman who believed in hard work and keeping to your own kind. He'd raised his daughter alone after her mother died, and he'd been fiercely protective ever since. His prejudices ran deep, carved by a lifetime of watching rich men step on working people. When Callista had first mentioned Leon's name, Henry had seen disaster coming like a freight train. He'd been right, he told himself, but watching his granddaughter fight for her life, he wondered if being right was worth the price they were all paying. Dr. Clinton Ward moved through the chaos with practiced efficiency. At 40, he'd seen enough medical crises to know when time was truly running out. As the transplant coordinator, he dealt in percentages and windows of opportunity. The child needed a bone marrow transplant within the next 12 hours, or her failing blood cells would overwhelm her system. The National Registry had no matches. The mother wasn't compatible. That left one option, and Clinton didn't care about the personal drama. He cared about saving a life. Vivian Chen had been the head nurse in pediatric intensive care for 5 years. At 33, she developed the ability to deliver devastating news with compassion while maintaining the professional boundaries that kept her sane. She'd been monitoring Audrey since admission, watching the numbers that told the story no parent wanted to hear. White blood cells dangerously low. Platelet count plummeting. The child's bone marrow was failing, possibly due to a rare genetic condition that had lain dormant until triggered by the infection. Vivian had seen miracles in these rooms, but she'd also seen tragedy. Tonight, hung in the balance, Dr. George Patterson was already scrubbing in, preparing for a surgery he hoped would happen. At 45, the transplant surgeon had steady hands and a reputation for pulling off the impossible. But even he needed raw materials to work with: a compatible donor, a stable patient, and time, always time. He reviewed Audrey's charts again, calculating dosages and procedures in his head. If they found a match, if the donor agreed, if the child's body could withstand the procedure, if a dozen other variables aligned, then maybe. Medicine was science, but at moments like these, it felt more like desperate hope. Serena Williams, the hospital's legal coordinator, waited with her tablet full of consent forms and liability waivers. At 34, she'd navigated hundreds of emergency medical situations, but cases involving estranged parents always complicated matters. The law was clear. Biological parents had rights, but so did legal guardians. When those roles conflicted, especially under time pressure, things could get messy. She'd already prepared the emergency court orders, just in case. Time was a luxury they didn't have for legal battles. The storm outside intensified, and somewhere in Manhattan, a phone was about to ring that would shatter Leon Harrington's carefully ordered world. Dr. George Patterson entered the room with the gravity of a man about to detonate a bomb. His words were clinical, stripped of any cushioning that might soften their impact. Audrey needed a bone marrow transplant immediately. Her rare blood disorder, triggered by the infection, had sent her immune system into catastrophic failure. Without new stem cells to rebuild her bone marrow, her body would shut down within hours. The National Registry search had yielded nothing. International databases were too far away to help within their window. The best chance, the only real chance, was a biological parent. Callista's hands trembled as she absorbed each word. The medical terminology washed over her like ice water. Aplastic crisis, stem cell transplant, histocompatibility. Each phrase another stone in the wall between her daughter and survival. She'd already been tested. Incompatible. The cruel irony of carrying a child for 9 months, only to be unable to save her life, burned in her chest. Clinton Ward stood nearby, his tablet showing real-time updates on Audrey's declining blood counts. Every minute mattered. Every decision had consequences. Vivian approached with unexpected gentleness, her hand resting lightly on Callista's shoulder. She'd seen this moment too many times, the point where pride and past pain had to be weighed against a child's life. Her voice was soft but insistent as she spoke the words Callista had been dreading. The biological father needed to be contacted. Tested. Given the chance to save his daughter. The alternative was unthinkable. But Vivian didn't say that part. She didn't need to. The monitors surrounding Audrey's bed sang that truth in electronic beats and falling numbers. The internal war that raged in Callista's mind was swift and brutal. Every fiber of her being recoiled at the thought of calling Leon. He'd walked away. He'd chosen his empire over their love. When she'd needed him most, when the world had been crashing down around them, he'd simply left. The humiliation of begging him for help tasted like acid in her throat. But then Audrey's hand moved slightly, those tiny fingers that had wrapped around Callista's heart from the moment she was born. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. Her daughter's life was worth any humiliation. The phone felt like lead in her hand as she found his number, still saved under L in her contacts. She'd meant to delete it 100 times but never could. The call connected after 2 rings. His voice, that deep timbre that had once whispered promises in the dark, was all business, cold, professional, until she spoke the words that changed everything. The silence that followed stretched like an eternity. She could hear his breathing change, the careful control cracking. When she told him about Audrey, about the transplant, about the ticking clock counting down their daughter's life, the silence became deafening. His response was immediate. 2 words that carried the weight of a complete transformation. "I'm coming." The line went dead. Somewhere in Manhattan, Leon Harrington was already moving, his ordered world exploding into chaos. The private jet was being prepared. The car was being called. The man who scheduled his life in 15-minute increments was about to race against time itself. The rain had been lighter then, 10 months ago. when everything had fallen apart. They'd met 18 months before that, an unlikely collision at a charity tech conference. Callista had been working as a contract project coordinator, helping organize the event that Leon's company was sponsoring. She'd challenged him during a panel discussion, questioning whether his company's technology truly served humanity or just profit margins. Instead of dismissing her, he'd sought her out afterward, intrigued by someone who didn't defer to his wealth or position. Coffee had turned into late-night conversations about changing the world through innovation. Their romance had been a whirlwind of stolen moments between his board meetings and her double shifts. She'd shown him a world beyond corporate victories, food trucks instead of five-star restaurants, walks in Central Park instead of exclusive clubs. He'd been different then. Or perhaps she'd simply believed he could be. There had been talk of a future, of breaking down the walls between their worlds. He'd given her a key to his penthouse, a gesture that had felt like a promise. She'd given him her whole heart, a gift she couldn't take back. The cracks had started with a gossip column photo. Leon at a business dinner with a stunning brunette, the daughter of a potential investor. The caption had been salacious, the implications clear. When Callista had asked, he'd dismissed it as meaningless business, his tone carrying an edge of irritation that she'd even questioned him. But Henry had seen the photo too, and her father's warnings had grown louder. Men like Leon didn't marry women like her. She was a distraction, a phase. When it mattered, he'd choose his own kind. The words had burrowed under her skin like splinters. The final fight had been volcanic. Another photo, another woman, another business explanation that felt like a lie. She'd been emotional, perhaps irrational. Her period late, and her emotions raw with the secret she hadn't yet confirmed. He'd been cold, controlled, his patience finally snapping. Words had been thrown like weapons. She was being ridiculous. He was being heartless. She was too emotional. He was too detached. When he'd walked out of her apartment that night, the door slamming behind him, she'd known it was over. The pregnancy test the next morning had only confirmed that her life was about to change in ways he'd never know about. The decision to keep the pregnancy secret had been born from pride and pain in equal measure. He'd made his choice. He'd walked away when things got difficult. Why should she give him the chance to reject their child too? Or worse, to fight for custody, to use his wealth and power to take the baby away. She'd convinced herself it was protection, for her and for the child. Henry had supported her decision, even helped her move to a smaller apartment, change jobs, disappear from Leon's orbit entirely. It had been easier than she'd expected. He'd never called, never came looking. It was as if she'd never existed at all. The emergency room doors burst open with a violence that made everyone turn. Leon Harrington stood there, rain-soaked despite the umbrella his assistant held. His usually perfect appearance disheveled from the race across the city. His eyes swept the room with laser focus until they found Callista. The 18 inches between them might as well have been an ocean. She saw him clock every detail, her exhaustion, her terror, the way she stood like a guard between him and the door to Audrey's room. His jaw clenched, a muscle ticking with suppressed emotion. The confrontation was immediate and raw. His first words weren't a greeting but an accusation wrapped in disbelief. "Why didn't you tell me?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Callista's response came from a deep well of hurt she'd thought had run dry. "Because when I needed you most, when everything was falling apart, you walked away. You chose your perfect life over us." The words were barely above a whisper, but they carried the weight of 10 months of single motherhood, of nights walking a crying baby alone, of watching other children with their fathers at the park. Clinton Ward inserted himself into the moment with clinical efficiency, his tablet already displaying consent forms and testing protocols. He didn't care about their drama. The child needed a donor, and the biological father was here. Time was wasting on emotional archaeology. His interruption was a bucket of cold water on the fire between them. The procedures were explained in rapid-fire medical speak. Blood draws for HLA typing. Consent forms for donation. Risk assessments. Timeline critical. Every second of delay decreased the chances of success. Serena Williams materialized with her legal documents, her presence a reminder that this wasn't just a medical crisis but a legal minefield. She explained with practiced precision the implications of biological paternity, donor rights, and emergency medical custody. If Leon was confirmed as the biological father and proved to be a match, he would need to consent to the procedure. But consent didn't automatically grant custody rights. Those would be separate proceedings, if he chose to pursue them. The unspoken threat hung in the air he could save his daughter, and then fight for her. Leon's attention had shifted to the window of Audrey's room. Through the glass, he could see her for the first time. The tiny form on the bed, surrounded by machines, fighting for each breath. Something fundamental shifted in his expression, the cold control cracking like ice in spring. When he turned back, his words were measured but different. "I'll take the test. I'll do whatever's needed." His eyes found Callista's. "We can deal with everything else after she's safe." It wasn't forgiveness or understanding, but it was a truce. For now, Audrey came first. The testing process was a marathon sprint compressed into 2 hours. Blood draws, genetic markers, compatibility percentages, calculated and recalculated. Leon sat in the sterile room as they extracted vial after vial, his expensive suit jacket discarded, sleeve rolled up, watching his blood fill the tubes that might save a daughter he'd never known existed. His phone buzzed constantly, board meetings, international calls, million-dollar decisions all ignored. Oliver, his assistant, fielded the calls from the hallway, rescheduling his entire life without question. Callista paced the corridor like a caged animal, her body vibrating with tension. Every few minutes, she checked on Audrey, watching the monitors, touching her daughter's hand, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. The nurses moved around her with practiced efficiency, adjusting medications, monitoring vitals, maintaining the delicate balance that kept Audrey stable. The clock on the wall seemed to mock them, its hands moving too fast and too slow simultaneously. Henry arrived during the second hour, his face a storm of conflicting emotions. Seeing Leon there, sleeves rolled up, being tested to save his granddaughter, challenged every prejudice he'd carefully maintained. The two men regarded each other across the waiting room like fighters sizing up opponents. But when Leon simply nodded, a gesture of acknowledgement without submission, Henry found himself nodding back. The war between them seemed suddenly insignificant compared to the battle Audrey was fighting. The parallel internal journeys were invisible but profound. Callista wrestled with 10 months of single motherhood, the pride in her independence, the fear of losing control, the deep exhaustion of carrying everything alone, and the treacherous hope that maybe she wouldn't have to anymore. Every time she looked at Leon, she saw the man who'd left and the father who'd come running. The contradiction was tearing her apart. She'd built walls to protect herself and Audrey. But those same walls might have robbed her daughter of a father, who clearly would have cared. Leon's mind was recalculating everything at processor speed. A daughter. He had a daughter who looked like him, who was dying, who had existed for a year without his knowledge. The control he'd spent his entire life maintaining had been an illusion. While he'd been conquering markets and building empires, his child had been taking first breaths, first laughs, fighting first fevers. The rage at being excluded warred with the understanding of why. He'd walked away. He'd chosen the safety of his controlled world over the messy uncertainty of love. Now, the cost of that choice was lying in a hospital bed, fighting for each breath. When Dr. Patterson returned with the results, his usual clinical detachment had been replaced by something closer to relief. Leon was a match, not just compatible, but optimal, the kind of match that made medical professionals believe in miracles. The room erupted in controlled chaos. Consent forms appeared. Procedures were explained. Timelines established. The donation would happen immediately. They'd extract bone marrow from Leon's hip, process it, and transfuse the stem cells into Audrey. If her body accepted them, if the cells engrafted, if her immune system could rebuild too many ifs. But it was hope. Leon signed every form without hesitation, without reading the fine print that Serena assured him protected the hospital from liability. When she mentioned the custody implications again, he cut her off with uncharacteristic sharpness. "I don't care about any of that right now. Just save her." But his eyes found Callista as he spoke. and she saw something there that made her chest tight. This wasn't over. This was just a pause in a larger conversation they'd have to have. If Audrey survived. When Audrey survived, she had to survive. The preparation for the procedure was swift but thorough. George explained the risks with surgical precision: infection, reaction to anesthesia, post-operative pain. For Leon, the risks were minimal. For Audrey, they were everything. Her weakened state made every intervention dangerous, but doing nothing was certain death. The window was closing. Every minute of delay meant more damage to her failing system. They needed to move now. In the pre-operative room, something unexpected happened. Leon asked to see Audrey before the procedure, not through glass, but in person. Callista hesitated, a dozen reasons to say no flooding her mind. But the look in his eyes wasn't the cold businessman she remembered. It was raw, vulnerable, the look of a father about to risk everything for a child he'd just discovered. She nodded, and they entered together. The moment Leon saw Audrey up close, his composure finally cracked completely. She was so small, so fragile, but even unconscious. He could see himself in the shape of her nose, the curve of her lips. When he reached out tentatively, his large hand dwarfing her tiny one, her fingers instinctively curled around his thumb. The sob that escaped him was involuntary, primal. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Though whether to Audrey, or Callista, or the universe itself, wasn't clear. "I'm here now. Daddy's here." Callista turned away, her own tears finally breaking free. The revelation came from Henry, of all people. He pulled Callista aside while Leon was being prepped for surgery, his weathered face carrying a weight of guilt she'd never seen before. The words tumbled out like a confession. 10 months ago, after the first photograph had appeared, he'd done more than just warn her. He'd sent Leon fabricated evidence of Callista with another man, photos doctored by a cousin who worked in digital media. He'd threatened to ruin her reputation if she stayed with him, to make sure everyone in Leon's world knew she was just another gold digger. He'd even suggested to mutual acquaintances that she'd been unfaithful. The truth hit Callista like a physical blow. Her father, the man who'd raised her to value honesty above all else, had orchestrated the destruction of her relationship. His prejudices and fears had robbed Audrey of her father, robbed her of the partnership she might have had in raising their daughter. The rage that filled her was volcanic, but it had nowhere to go. Henry stood there, shoulders bowed, looking every one of his 58 years and more. "I thought I was protecting you," he said. But the words were hollow. They both knew the truth. He'd been protecting his own narrow view of how the world should work. The second revelation came moments later when Leon, sedated but not yet unconscious, grabbed Callista's hand. His words were slurred but clear enough. The photos were nothing. Business. Always business. Never anyone else. Just you. Only ever you. The anesthesia took him before she could respond, but the damage to her carefully constructed narrative was complete. They'd both been victims of manipulation, of lies designed to drive them apart. But she'd believed it so easily. And he'd walked away so quickly. Maybe Henry's lies had only worked because the foundation had already been cracked. George emerged from checking on Audrey one final time before the procedures began. His words were carefully chosen but urgent. They had perhaps 4 hours before Audrey's blood counts dropped below recoverable levels. The extraction from Leon would take 90 minutes. Processing the marrow, another hour. The transfusion itself was relatively quick. But then they'd have to wait to see if the cells would engraft. It would be, he said with clinical understatement, a long night, the longest night of their lives. The surgical suite was a symphony of controlled chaos. 2 operating rooms running in parallel, one where George and his team extracted marrow from Leon's hip bone, the other where Audrey was being prepared to receive it. The extraction was more violent than Callista had imagined, large needles penetrating bone, drawing out the liquid life that might save their daughter. She watched through the observation window as Leon's body tensed even under anesthesia, his unconscious form fighting the invasion despite the necessity. In the other room, Vivian and her team worked with delicate precision around Audrey. Her tiny body seemed to disappear among the equipment, the tubes and wires that kept her stable while they prepared for the transfusion. The contrast was stark, Leon's strong body being harvested for its strength, Audrey's fragile form, waiting to receive it. The poetry of it wasn't lost on Callista. The man who'd helped create this child but had been absent for her life was now giving the most fundamental part of himself to save her. The clock moved with excruciating slowness. 3:17 in the morning. The exact time was etched into Callista's memory as she watched the bag of processed stem cells being connected to Audrey's foreline. The dark red liquid moved through the tube with agonizing patience. Each drop a possibility, a chance, a prayer. George monitored every vital sign, calling out adjustments to medications, watching for any sign of rejection or reaction. But Audrey's small body accepted her father's cells without protest, as if recognizing something fundamental, something that belonged. Clinton Ward stood at his station, updating charts with mechanical precision, but even his clinical detachment showed cracks. This was the kind of case that reminded everyone why they'd gone into medicine, the chance to witness something that bordered on miraculous. The numbers on the monitors began to stabilize, not improving yet, but no longer declining. It was, as George said quietly, a good sign. The cells were beginning their work, finding their way to Audrey's bone marrow, setting up shop to rebuild what had been destroyed. The waiting was its own kind of torture. Leon woke from anesthesia disoriented, but immediately asking about Audrey. The pain in his hip was significant, but he refused pain medication that might cloud his awareness. He needed to be present, to know moment by moment how his daughter was doing. When they wheeled him to recovery, he insisted on being placed where he could see Audrey's room. The sight of her, still unconscious but stable, seemed to anchor him in a way Callista had never seen. Hours passed in a strange, suspended state. The storm outside had passed, leaving the city washed clean under a canopy of stars barely visible through the light pollution. In the family waiting room, an unlikely alliance formed. Henry sat with Oliver, Leon's assistant, sharing terrible hospital coffee and stories about their respective roles in the drama. Henry's confession hadn't been heard by Leon yet, but Oliver seemed to understand that the older man was carrying a weight of guilt that was punishment enough for now. Serena had long since filed her paperwork and gone home, but not before ensuring that all legal requirements were met. The consent forms were ironclad. Leon had donated freely, without coercion or condition. Any custody battles would be separate from this medical emergency. But watching Leon maintain his vigil, she suspected that the real battle would be not in courtrooms, but in the careful negotiation of two people learning to be parents together after trust had been shattered. The first signs of improvement came with the dawn. Audrey's white blood cell count had stopped dropping. Then, miraculously, it began to rise. Slowly, incrementally, but undeniably. The stem cells were engrafting, finding their home in her bone marrow, beginning the work of rebuilding her immune system. George allowed himself a small smile when he delivered the news. They weren't out of the woods, but they were heading in the right direction. The next 24 hours would be critical, but for the first time since Audrey had arrived, the prognosis was hopeful. Leon's recovery was swift, driven by determination rather than physical resilience. By noon, he was on his feet despite medical advice to rest. He'd been on the phone with Oliver, not about business, but about setting up a pediatric wing donation to the hospital. About ensuring Audrey would have the best continued care, about 100 details that revealed how his mind worked when focused on something that truly mattered. But he was careful not to overstep. Each decision run past Callista, acknowledging her role as Audrey's primary parent, even as he carved out space for himself. 3 days later, Audrey opened her eyes fully for the first time since the transplant. The fever had broken. Her breathing was unassisted. The monitors sang a steadier song of recovery. When she saw Leon sitting beside her bed, a man she didn't recognize but somehow seemed to know, she reached out with the curiosity that had survived her ordeal. He took her tiny hand with infinite gentleness, and she smiled, a small, tired smile, but genuine. Callista watched from the doorway as father and daughter truly met for the first time. 2 weeks passed in a blur of recovery and adjustment. Audrey grew stronger each day, the resilience of children amazing, even the seasoned medical staff. Leon had essentially moved into the hospital, conducting business from the family lounge, refusing to miss a moment more of his daughter's life. He learned her favorite lullaby from Callista, memorized the way she liked her bottle held, discovered that she laughed when he made silly faces. The cold businessman was transforming into something neither of them had expected: a devoted father. The conversation about the future happened in the hospital garden on a crisp morning 3 weeks after the transplant. Audrey was in a stroller, bundled against the cold but breathing free air for the first time in almost a month. Vivian had joked that she was their miracle baby, the case that reminded everyone why they did this work. The garden was mostly empty, just the three of them, and the weight of everything unsaid. Leon spoke first, his words carefully chosen. He didn't want to fight for custody. He wanted to find a way to be present, to be the father Audrey deserved. He acknowledged the pain of the past, the mistakes on both sides, the time lost. But he was more interested in the future than relitigating history. His proposal was measured but genuine: shared custody, gradual integration into Audrey's life, financial support without conditions, and, most importantly, putting Audrey's needs first in every decision. Callista had spent 3 weeks preparing for a battle that wasn't coming. The relief was overwhelming, but so was the fear. Letting Leon in meant risking hurt again, not just for her but for Audrey. But watching them together, seeing the way Audrey lit up when he entered the room, she knew the decision was already made. Her daughter deserved both parents, deserved the chance at a complete family, even if that family looked different than the traditional picture. Henry's apology to Leon happened without fanfare. The two men stood in the hospital cafeteria, the older man's words simple and direct. He'd been wrong. He'd let his prejudices destroy something that might have been good. He didn't ask for forgiveness, just acknowledged the harm he'd caused. Leon's response surprised everyone, including himself. He thanked Henry for protecting Callista the best way he knew how, even if the method was wrong. They shook hands, not as friends, but as men who would both be part of Audrey's life. The legal arrangements were formalized gradually. Serena, who'd returned to help with the custody agreement, found herself drafting something unprecedented: a document based entirely on cooperation rather than conflict. Leon would have increasing visitation, building to shared custody as Audrey adjusted. Financial support was generous, but structured to support both Audrey and Callista's ability to remain her primary caregiver. Most importantly, all major decisions would be made jointly, forcing them to communicate, to work together, to be partners in parenting, if nothing else. 6 weeks after the transplant, Audrey was released from the hospital. The team that had saved her lined the hallway as she left, Vivian wiping tears as the little girl waved goodbye. George, typically stoic, allowed himself a genuine smile. Even Clinton Ward seemed affected, his clinical efficiency cracking just enough to reveal the human underneath. They'd all been part of something extraordinary, a reminder of why medicine could still feel like magic sometimes. The new normal emerged slowly. Leon had purchased a brownstone in Brooklyn, close enough to Callista's apartment to make transitions easy, but maintaining separate spaces while they navigated their complex relationship. Audrey adapted with the resilience of children, accepting her father's presence as naturally as she'd accepted his absence. She had 2 homes now, 2 bedrooms filled with toys, 2 parents who loved her fiercely, if not together. The first time Leon kept Audrey overnight on his own, Callista barely slept. She'd prepared him with pages of instructions, emergency numbers, favorite foods, and bedtime routines. But when she picked Audrey up the next morning, she found them both asleep on the couch. Audrey curled on Leon's chest, a children's book fallen to the floor beside them. The sight broke something open in her chest, not pain this time, but possibility. 3 months post-transplant, at Audrey's follow-up appointment, George delivered the news they'd all been hoping for. The engraftment was complete. Audrey's bone marrow was functioning normally. While she'd need monitoring for years to come, the immediate crisis was over. She was, in medical terms, cured. The 3 of them sat in the same room where they'd first heard the devastating diagnosis, but now it held the echo of a miracle rather than a tragedy. The moment that changed everything came on an ordinary Thursday evening. Leon had brought Audrey back from a day at the Children's Museum, and she was exhausted, but happy. As Callista lifted her from his arms, Audrey reached back for Leon, saying clearly, "Dada, stay." 2 words that shifted the entire universe. Leon froze. Callista held her breath. Then Audrey repeated it, more insistently. Dada stay, Mama. The choice was suddenly clear, not between past and future, but between fear and hope. That night, Leon stayed for dinner. It was awkward at first, the two of them navigating around each other in the small kitchen, but Audrey's joy was infectious. She sat in her high chair, babbling happily, food in her hair, completely unaware of the emotional archaeology happening around her. When she fell asleep, they found themselves on the couch, talking in ways they hadn't even when they were together. About the fear during those hospital nights. About the mistakes they'd both made. About the possibility of something new, built on different ground. The proposal, when it came 6 months later, wasn't grand or dramatic. They were in the hospital garden where they'd had their first real conversation about the future. Audrey was walking now, toddling between them, the picture of health. Leon pulled out the small moon charm that had been on Audrey's bracelet, now set into a simple ring. His words were plain but true. He'd come back that night to save their daughter, but somewhere along the way, she'd saved him. He wasn't asking to reclaim the past, but to build a future. Not because of Audrey, though she was the bridge, but because losing Callista had been the worst mistake of his carefully controlled life. Callista's answer came not in words but in understanding. They weren't the same people who'd fallen in love 2 years ago. They were parents now, shaped by crisis, bonded by the miraculous recovery of their daughter. Trust would take time to rebuild. Love would look different than before. But as Audrey laughed, chasing a butterfly through the garden where her parents had found their way back to each other, the future seemed less frightening than hopeful. The wedding was small, just family and the medical team that had become family. Vivian served as maid of honor, joking that she'd been their couple's therapist through it all. George walked Callista down the aisle since Henry, in a moment of humility, had insisted that the doctor who'd saved his granddaughter deserved that honor. Oliver was Leon's best man, having witnessed the transformation from cold CEO to devoted father. Even Clinton Ward attended, claiming he never missed a good outcome story. The morning sun painted the hospital garden gold as the small ceremony concluded. Audrey, now 18 months old and thriving, toddled between her parents in a tiny white dress, clutching the moon charm that had traveled such a long journey. As Leon lifted her up, one arm around her and the other pulling Callista close, he spoke the truth that had taken them all so long to understand. Love wasn't just the choosing, it was the staying, night after night, through every crisis and quiet moment, through the fear and the joy, choosing to remain. The garden where they'd first negotiated their daughter's future was now witness to their new beginning. Not a fairy tale ending, but something more valuable, a real family, forged in crisis, strengthened by forgiveness, and held together by the tiny girl who'd needed them both to survive. The sunrise through the windows wasn't just light breaking through darkness. It was promise. It was hope. It was tomorrow. And all the tomorrows after that, chosen deliberately, one night at a time.